Welcome to my channel, English Epic. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. It hit me like a freight train, that slow, creeping suspicion. I tried to dismiss Claire, and I had been married for almost 10 years, and I thought I knew her better than anyone. We had our routines, shared chores, went on vacations, and even managed the usual ups and downs. But a series of subtle changes began to surface, almost unnoticeable. At first she was going on more business trips, for instance, and occasionally I'd catch her in vague stories about these conferences that didn't add up. I would brush off the uncomfortable feeling, gnawing at my gut, telling myself I was overthinking things. After all, everyone deserves trust in a relationship.
Right.
Then one evening I noticed the peculiar credit card charge. It was from a hotel close enough to our town that it didn't make sense. Claire had mentioned a trip out of state, yet there it was, a charge from a hotel just 40 minutes away. I told myself it could be a mix-up or perhaps something related to her work, but that wasn't all. She'd seemed more guarded with her phone, which she rarely left out of reach. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was one particular weekend that I'll never forget. Claire had told me she'd be gone for another conference, this time in New York. I pretended everything was normal as she packed, gave her the usual hug and kiss goodbye, and told her to have a good trip. But as I watched her drive off, a thought crossed my mind. What if this wasn't a conference at all? I tried to shake it off, but it lingered, growing stronger as the weekend passed. The kids were at my mother's that weekend, and I had too much time alone to think. I replayed odd interactions, her frequent late work nights and time. She would disappear for extended errands, and I couldn't ignore the creeping sense that I was missing something critical. The next day, her phone was left out on the counter. It was unusual. She never forgot her phone. My heart pounded as I stood there staring at it. I debated with myself, telling myself to walk away, but something inside me had already made up its mind. I picked up her phone hands as I navigated to her messages there. Plain as day were texts from a contact labeled Mark from Marketing Mark. The name clicked immediately. I remembered him. He'd been to our home once for dinner, back when Claire said he was her work buddy. He was pleasant, charming even, and had stayed for drinks after dinner, but I'd never thought twice about him until now. The messages between them shattered any illusions I'd held. I read them slowly, feeling like I was watching someone else's life unravel. The texts were affectionate, personal, with references to our weekend plans, and even a message that read, "Can't wait to see you again." My blood ran cold as I scrolled, realizing how long this had likely been going on right under my nose. Claire had turned our marriage into some twisted farce, and I had been playing the fool. I tried to gather my thoughts, my mind racing. Confronting her was out of the question. I wasn't ready to let her spin this into some misunderstanding or brush it off with excuses. No, if I was going to do this, I needed a plan, a solid, well-executed plan that would leave her no room for escape. I decided I'd gather evidence first, that way she couldn't twist it or deny it. This time I'd have the upper hand. Over the next few days I focused on finding more proof, securing details that would solidify the truth I'd uncovered. I pulled phone records, looked through old emails, and quietly observed her behavior. It was painful to play the role of the trusting husband, but I knew the payoff would be worth it. The evidence piled up, each piece, adding to the sickening betrayal I felt in my gut, and then I made my decision. I would file for divorce. It felt surreal to even consider it after years of believing in us, of putting in the work to keep things together. This was the end. There would be no grand reconciliation, no desperate counseling sessions. She had made her choice, and now I would make mine. But I wouldn't go down quietly. I wanted her to understand the full weight of what she had done. I wanted her to feel the regret that would haunt her long after I walked away. So I set the final part of my plan in motion, a confrontation that would make everything clear. By the time Claire returned home, I had it all mapped out in my mind, every word I planned to say, every piece of evidence laid out waiting for her like landmines. I wanted to feel calm, methodical. This was just another plan, like a business project, I told myself. But it wasn't. This was my life, and beneath the calm facade I could feel my emotions swirling, hurt and grim satisfaction at the thought of her face. When she saw what I had uncovered, she breezed into the house that Sunday evening, suitcase in hand, looking perfectly at ease. It hit me just how deeply she'd been lying. There wasn't a trace of guilt or remorse. I watched her unpack, talking about her conference, and what a good networking opportunity it had been. The words felt hollow, scripted, and I wondered if they always had been. My mind flashed back to all the times she'd come back from these so-called work trips, All those hugs, kisses, and greetings at the door suddenly felt tainted. Once she was settled, I called her into the living room. She sat across from me, legs crossed, looking as though she was about to watch her favorite show on TV. There was no sign that she had any idea what was coming. I almost felt sorry for her, almost Claire. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my tone steady. Her eyes flickered slightly, but she kept her composure. "Sure, what's up?" she replied casually, as if we were about to discuss dinner plans. "I want you to listen to me very carefully," I said. Pulling out my phone, I opened the photo gallery and began scrolling through the screenshots. I'd taken the text messages, the hotel receipts, everything. I handed her the phone, and for the first time I saw the crack in her confident facade. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the images, her hand trembling just slightly. She looked up at me, mouth open, as though she was trying to find the right words. What is this?" She stammered, the shock clear in her voice. I took a deep breath, holding back the anger that had been building inside me. "These are your messages with marked the receipts from the hotel down the road. All those conferences you were supposedly attending. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" She looked down, color draining from her face. "It's not what you think," she mumbled. Her voice was small, weak, completely different from the confident woman I had known. "Really?" I replied, my tone laced with disbelief. "Then tell me, what is it? Because it looks a lot like my wife has been sneaking around with another man for who knows how long." She didn't respond, just stared at the floor, twisting her hands together. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. It was like all the lies had finally caught up to her, and she was drowning in them. After a moment she looked up, her eyes shining with tears. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." She whispered the words barely audible. I almost laughed at that. "You didn't mean for it to happen like this, Claire. You planned this. You lied to my face, to our kids' faces for months, and now you have the nerve to sit here and tell me you didn't mean for it to happen." She opened her mouth to say something, but I cut her off. "No, you don't get to explain this away. I don't want your excuses. I just want the truth. How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, swallowing hard. "About a year," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "A year," I repeated, letting the words sink in. I had spent a year trusting her, loving her, while she was betraying me at every turn. It felt like a sick joke. I leaned back, feeling the weight of it all settle over me. "I can't believe this," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "I gave you everything, Claire. I trusted you completely." Her tears started falling, and she reached out, touching my hand lightly. "Please, I'm sorry, it was a mistake." Stop," I said, pulling my hand away. "Don't. I don't want to hear your apologies. They're meaningless to me." Now she looked like she was about to say something, but then she stopped, letting her hand fall back to her lap. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity. I could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that she had finally lost control of the narrative. She was no longer the one pulling the strings. "I'm filing for divorce," I said. Finally, my voice steady. The words felt strange, foreign, but they were the only option left. She looked at me, stunned, like she hadn't seen it coming. "You think I can just forget this? Go back to the way things were? You destroyed any chance of that. The moment you stepped out of this marriage," her face crumpled and she started sobbing. But I didn't feel any sympathy. She had made her choice, and now she was going to have to live with it. I stood up, grabbing my coat. "I'll be staying somewhere else tonight. You have until the end of the week to pack your things and leave." "Wait, please," she begged, standing up and grabbing my arm. "Don't do this. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. I'll do anything. Just don't end it like this." I looked at her hand on my arm, and then at her tear-streaked face for a moment. I almost wavered, almost allowed myself to believe that things could go back to the way they were, but the pain of her betrayal was too deep, too raw. "No, Claire, there's no fixing this. You destroyed our marriage, not me." I pulled my arm away and headed for the door, leaving her standing there broken. As I walked out of the house, I felt a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak. Relief that I was finally free from the lies and deception, but heartbreak over the life we built that was now crumbling. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I'd made the right choice. The days that followed were a blur of quiet heartbreak, legal consultations, and family discussions. I moved into a friend's guest room temporarily, though I spent most days with the kids, trying to keep things as normal as possible for them. I hadn't told them the whole truth yet, just that Mom and Dad needed some time apart, and that I'd be staying somewhere else for a little while. I could see their confusion, especially my youngest, who kept asking when I'd be coming home. Those moments nearly broke me, but I knew I had to keep going. Claire, in the meantime, was desperate. Every time we spoke, she tried to convince me that we could work it out, begging me to come home to give her a second chance. She flooded my inbox with lengthy emails and sent messages filled with apologies and promises to change. I ignored most of them, but the few I read only cemented my decision to move forward with the divorce. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the deception, the boldness of her lies, and the realization that she'd been willing to risk everything. We had built together for some meaningless fling.it was like she had rewritten our entire history in a language I couldn't understand, and there was no way to undo that. The worst of it was having to face the practical realities of separation. Claire and I had shared everything: bank accounts, credit cards. The house untangling our lives meant looking at the life we'd built together and deciding who would get what. It was painful. Even more so, because each item, every piece of furniture and bank statement carried memories with it. I'd been the one to open our first joint account. Taking her to the bank on a warm autumn afternoon, we'd smiled at each other, talking about our future together, about the life we wanted to build. I could still feel the echo of that moment, like a shadow trailing behind. Remind how. One, after a particularly grueling day of discussing the legal logistics with my lawyer, I found myself sitting alone in my car, unable to go back to the empty room I'd been staying in. My mind wandered to Claire again, as it had so many times. I thought of all the times we'd stayed up late, talking about our dreams and plans, sharing secrets, promises. It felt like I'd been living in a movie that had suddenly turned into a horror show, one where everything was familiar but twisted into something unrecognizable in the worst part. I had no idea who the person I'd shared my life with really was. Just then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Claire. I almost ignored it, but something made me open it. It was another apology, but this time she sounded different. Calmer, less frantic. She wrote about her regrets, admitting she had taken me for granted and hadn't truly realized the gravity of what she was risking. But she didn't stop there. She mentioned Mark, how things between them were nothing more than a fantasy, a selfish escape from a life she claimed had started to feel stifling. She tried to explain her affair as a mistake born out of her own insecurities, her need for validation outside of our marriage. Reading her words felt surreal, like I was dissecting a stranger's thoughts as I read. Anger started bubbling up again. How could she call it a mistake when it had lasted for over a year? How could she reduce everything to some misguided quest for excitement while she tore our family apart? I wanted to tell her exactly how I felt, to throw every hurtful word I could muster at her, but as I started typing, I stopped myself. What would it change? Nothing she could say would undo what she had done. Her explanations only made it clearer to me that I was making the right decision. The day came for us to tell the kids, and I could barely hold myself together. Sitting them down in the living room, Claire and I explained, as gently as we could, that Mom and Dad would no longer be together, that we loved them more than anything and would always be there for them. I could see the pain in their eyes, the confusion as they tried to make sense of a world that had suddenly become uncertain. My oldest, who was more perceptive than I'd realized, asked if we'd ever get back together. I had to look away, struggling to find the words. But Claire stepped in, giving him a gentle shake of her head. The honesty and that small gesture broke something in me, and I excused myself, feeling my composure slipping away. Once the conversation was over and the kids were settled, I finally let myself feel the weight of it all. I walked outside, standing under the night sky, breathing in the cool air. I had been holding it together for everyone else, keeping my emotions in check so I could get through each day. But out there alone, it all came rushing out. Anger, sadness, betrayal. It all hit me like a tidal wave. I wanted to scream, to break something, to let out all the pain that had been festering inside. But instead, I stood there, letting the silence swallow my grief. In the days that followed, I focused on setting up my own space. I found a small apartment a few miles from the kids' school, a modest place where I could start over, away from the memories that haunted our family home. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I poured myself into making it a place where the kids could feel comfortable, where they could see that life would go on, even if it looked different now. One night while unpacking, I stumbled across a box filled with old photographs of Claire and me, our wedding day, our first home vacations with the kids. I stared at the pictures, feeling the sting of nostalgia. It was like looking at a life that belonged to someone else. I took out one photo in particular, a shot of us on our honeymoon, standing on a beach, laughing. I remembered that moment vividly. The laughter, the love, the dreams that felt so solid, so real. I wondered how it all had turned into this nightmare. As I slid the photo back into the box, I realized that while the memories still held power over me, they no longer defined who I was or who I would become. Claire had betrayed the life we'd built together, but I still had a future, and while the path ahead seemed uncertain, I knew that someday I would find peace. The first few months after Claire and I separated were the hardest of my life. Every time I saw her, when I picked up the kids, I felt an echo of the anger and betrayal I had once felt. But I had my new place, my kids, and the promise of a fresh start. I focused on my work, my health, and the future, forcing myself to move forward even when the past clung to me like a shadow. Then, one evening while picking up the kids from Claire's, she asked if we could talk. I hesitated but agreed. Curious what else she could possibly want to discuss, she led me to the backyard where we used to sit on summer nights. After the kids went to bed, it was strange standing there again, looking out over the yard where we'd shared so many moments that felt both close and distant. "Thank you," she said, softly, surprising me for being so understanding. Through all of this, even when I didn't deserve it, I couldn't meet her eyes. "What else is there to do? We've got the kids to think about." "I'm doing what I have to." She nodded, her expression unreadable. Then after a long pause, she said, "I know you probably won't believe this, but I never stopped loving you. I don't think I ever will." The words washed over me, leaving me cold. I thought about what to say, but before I could respond, Claire added, "I know it doesn't mean much now, and I know you probably won't ever forgive me. I've come to terms with that. I just wanted you to know." I shrugged, not wanting to linger on old wounds. "We're here for the kids. That's all that matters now." She looked as if she wanted to say more, but she let it drop, and I left relieved to be out of that house and back in my own space. I couldn't shake this strange feeling, though Claire seemed haunted by something, as if she was trying to hold on to something that was long gone. A few weeks later, I found myself at a coffee shop across town, catching up with an old friend from college. Chris had moved away after graduation, and we'd only kept up sporadically as we talked. He mentioned that he'd recently reconnected with some other mutual friends who had stayed in the area. "Oh, and you'll never guess who I ran into," Chris said, chuckling. "Mark Taylor, remember him?" I froze my coffee halfway to my mouth. "Mark Taylor?" "Yeah, he said he'd been working in marketing. I think actually he mentioned he used to work with your wife. Ex-wife. He said, you guys might know each other. Did he say anything else?" I asked, heart pounding. I knew my friend was oblivious to what this meant to me, but my mind was spinning. It couldn't be a coincidence. Chris shook his head. "Not much, just that he used to work at the same company." "Why?" "Oh, no reason. Just surprised to hear his name," I said, feigning calm, but inside the question was relentless. Why would Mark be back? Was Claire seeing him again? The thought gnawed at me. I told myself it didn't matter anymore, that whatever she chose to do was none of my business. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing. I decided I had to know for sure to put my suspicions to rest once and for all. That evening, after I dropped the kids off, I sat in my car outside Claire's house, my heart racing. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't leave until I had some answers. Just as I was about to give up and go home, I saw a familiar car pull into her driveway. Mark stepped out, looking around nervously before heading to the front door. Claire answered immediately, ushering him inside. I felt the blood drain from my face as much as I hated the thought of confronting them. I needed closure. I got out of the car and walked up the steps, knocking on the door before I could secure myself. I heard hushed voices, then the door opened, and there was Claire, her face pale. "Well," she stammered, glancing behind her, "I didn't expect you." "No, I don't think you did," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mark's here, isn't he?" She looked away, then reluctantly stepped aside to let me in. Mark was standing in the living room, looking as uneasy as Claire. I faced them both, feeling a mix of anger and the sick sense of déjà vu. "What's going on?" I asked, my tone sharp. Claire took a deep breath, looking between me and Mark before she finally spoke. "There's something I haven't told you, Will. Something you deserve to know." Mark shifted uncomfortably, and Claire continued. "What happened between me and Mark? It wasn't an affair in the way you thought." She hesitated, glancing at Mark. "It was a setup." I felt the room spinning. "A setup? What the hell are you talking about?" Mark spoke up, his voice tense. "Claire and we were trying to expose something going on at the company. There was a lot of shady stuff happening, embezzlement, fraud, you name it. We needed to make it look like we were involved. It was a cover, but we kept it from everyone, even you." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "So you're telling me you never had an affair?" Claire shook her head, her face etched with regret. "No, Will, it was all a lie to protect both of us. I couldn't tell you because I didn't want to put you at risk." "Put me at risk?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Claire, you let me believe you were cheating for months. You let me walk away." Tears welled in her eyes. "I know, I didn't think it would go this far. I thought I could keep it contained. I thought we could handle it on our own." I turned to Mark, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "And you, why the hell would you go along with this, Mark? Remand." "Because I owed Claire. She helped me get that job. When I was at my lowest, I wanted to repay her, but this... I didn't know it would ruin everything." I took a step back, feeling as though I'd been hit by a truck. "So, this whole thing, all of it, was it worth it? Claire, was destroying our marriage worth some scheme?" Claire's voice broke. "I thought I was protecting us. I thought once it was over, I could fix things. But by the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late." I looked at them both, feeling hollow, as though every ounce of energy had drained from my body. I had given up on us because I'd been so convinced of her betrayal. And now, after all this time, I was standing in the ruins of our life, realizing that nothing was as it seemed, with a deep breath. I looked Claire in the eye. "You should have told me, whatever your reasons, whatever you thought you were protecting, you should have told me the truth." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life." I turned, leaving the house without looking back, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. I had come seeking closure, and I'd found it. But it didn't change the fact that everything we'd once had was gone, lost to secrets and lies. As I walked away, I finally understood that the past was something I would never get back. And for the first time, I was ready to let it go.